ever seen these kids in the street? I know they look like a bunch of freaks to you, but they happen to be extremely smart and very politically minded, and they don't like that certain groups of people are treated unfair. So much so, in fact, that they pit themselves in direct opposition to mainstream society and live on the fringe. I should know, this was me 15 years ago. You can laugh, go ahead, those are big tonsils up there. I was squatting in the Lower East Side of New York City. For 3 years, I was bathing in open fire hydrants, dumpster diving for food, and living by the rules of the street. By the time I was 23, I couldn't count on both hands how many friends that I had that had died from suicide, murder, overdose, AIDS, or freak accidents. But despite this grim reality, we didn't trust help from outsiders. And I was fairly certain that I would not live to see my 25th birthday. But then somebody reached me, and a team of outreach workers and nurse practitioners and my therapist worked with me over the next few years to help me piece my life back together. See, they came out to the street to find me, and then when they got me to come back to their office, they met me with a smiling face every time. They were happy to see me, and they were extremely supportive, and they became my family. Now, it wasn't easy to find a place in a world I felt was so judgmental and unfair, but I kept pushing forward. Job, apartment, undergrad, and finally, graduate school at Yale University. So it should come as no surprise to you that since Yale, I've dedicated my life to believing in those whom others have written off and condemned. I've been working with teenage girls who are survivors of sex trafficking and exploitation. Sex trafficking is big news right now. The average age of entry into prostitution in the United States is 13 years old, and it's a life filled with daily violence. So much so that once you enter prostitution, your life expectancy becomes 7 years. And you can buy a kid online as easily as you can buy a book from Amazon.com. Florida's a hot spot. We're the third most popular trafficking destination in our country. And Miami, with our prestigious title of the second sexiest city in America, aside from Las Vegas, has a thriving sex industry with hundreds of children in it that we know of. So people often ask me, why is it so hard to help these kids? Why do the services that exist are not able to protect them from being exploited? Well, up until 2008, we didn't have any specialized programs that were working with these kids, like this one here, doing street outreach. Another thing is that these victims find it hard to leave. Aside from the obvious fear of reprisal, they're also not self-identifying as victims. See, the violence and the abuse has become a very normal part of their life. So this is a very simplified view of how we approach the issue of sex trafficking. Okay, to have sex trafficking of children, we need these elements. We need a child with vulnerabilities that puts them at risk. We need somebody that's willing to exploit those vulnerabilities for gain, and we need somebody that's willing to buy sex with a child. Okay? So if we want to get rid of the problem of sex trafficking, we have to eliminate at least one of these variables, right? So let's look at the buyer. Well, this is a very tedious task because 1 in 7 men of you out there are buying sex. So law enforcement tries to take out the trafficker. You take that guy out, and another one's filling his shoes in a second, okay? The most common system response that we see is that we remove the child from the situation. That's often an isolating and restrictive response that includes taking them away from family and friends, relocating them to different cities, moving them in and out of residential programs, and sometimes locking them up in detention for their own safety. Okay, so here's the problem with that. These youth are going to very much resist these kinds of coercive help, okay? So we want to ride in on our white horse and rescue these kids and take them as far away from the danger as we possibly can. But the reality of the situation is that they might just jump off the horse and run back to their abuser. Why? Well, one, because we judge. We don't mean to a lot of times, but we do. And we place unrealistic expectations and demands on these kids to fit inside our box. Programs don't prioritize basic human connections. Okay. But there's another reason. These traffickers, even though they're inflicting a great deal of abuse on these kids, are providing something that we in the system have a really difficult time doing. They're giving them a sense of belonging and acceptance. He's consistently blowing up her phone every time she's not answering it. He wants her, and he's filling her head with all these promises that he's going to fill her dreams. And what teenager doesn't want that? In the early days of our work in Miami, the prosecutor's office had their first human trafficking case. They were very frustrated because our 16-year-old victim wasn't cooperating with the investigation, and she kept running away. So as our last-ditch effort, they called me in, and I went down that day to her house. I drove an hour, and I sat with her and I chatted, and I developed a relationship with her, a rapport, and I didn't put any demands on her. And that next week, she began fully cooperating with the case. I continued to follow up with her and meet her where she's at and provide that support and help teach her tools to stay safe because there were very real threats to her safety. At the end, her pimp did time. And she is a college grad, a career professional, and a real superstar now. In Miami, we've gone from 1 to over 300 girls that have been helped in this specialized program. 85% of those girls, if they've been engaged in the program for over 6 months, are no longer being exploited. And that's a huge deal because these are kids who are almost exclusively chronic runaways. So how do we engage them? How do we get them to stay and want our help? We meet them where they're at, okay? We get out from behind the desk, we put our clipboard down, and we go hit the streets, sometimes at night, to ask if they're doing okay. We listen to them, and we respect them. We advocate for them, and we have their backs. We show up. We keep showing up. And we prove to them that out of all the programs that have opened and closed cases, all the people that have come and gone in their life and loved and hurt them, that we're going to be there at the end of the day to support them. In the field, we call this a transformational relationship. Transformational relationships are persistent. They're flexible. They're responsive. They're patient. They're empathetic, non-judgmental, supportive, and empowering. This is a really important concept. Transformational relationships do not isolate, judge. They do not dictate to these girls how they should be living their life. They do not lock them down for their own safety, and they certainly don't exclude them from their own growth process. Now, why is this important? Because we need to understand how we're going to keep these kids safe, not just today, because locking them down will keep them safe today, but how about next week? How about next month? How about when they turn 18 and the services start to drop? So I propose something a little bit different to this equation. I propose that instead of removing the child, we remove the vulnerability. Relationships that are present and mindful and connect you to a supportive community over the long term help empower youth to make healthier decisions and positive changes in their life. The family that I found in New York 15 years ago was exactly the connection that I needed to grow. Thanks to my own transformational relationship, I went from C-Squat to getting safe harbor legislation passed and signed by Governor Scott. And I believe these girls can do similar things. We really need to start rethinking how we're helping vulnerable kids in our system, especially victims of sex trafficking and exploitation. We need to start finding ways to build real, connecting, present relationships into our case plans and our protocols. Because if we don't show up, somebody else will. Is it going to be us, or is it going to be them? Thank you.